All right. So many attendees have regarded the Q&A session as the highlight of GSAS, and we are thrilled to bring it back this year. I know that Vlad was a big fan last year. He really enjoyed it. And here he is again. So it's really a perfect opportunity to pose any questions that may not have been covered earlier in the day or were left unaddressed in today's talks. Simply use Whova app to submit your questions, and we will do our best to provide comprehensive answers. Now I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our esteemed panelists who will be joining us on the stage for this Q&A session. So Nick Toon, you already know him, Principal Consultant and Empathy Software. Sonya Natanzon, Engineering Leader and Software Architect. Then we have Alejandro Moleiro, Engineering Manager for the Vinta Spain's platform. Then we have Vlad, our DDD expert. Ciceri, Software Architect at Apiumhub, and Neal Ford, Software Architect at ThoughtWorks. All right. Honestly, reviewing the questions, we have hundreds of them. So let's begin. And the first question is, there is an opinion that software architect role is dissolving in other leading roles and becoming obsolete. What do you think about that? Should we start widening our specialization? Who would like to start?
I'm happy to start because I've heard this for, I don't know, 15 years now, that the software, so when I joined ThoughtWorks, and this is relevant because it was 18 years ago, I was hired, my offer letter said application architect. So when I introduced myself to the first person at ThoughtWorks, they said, oh, great, it's nice to meet you. What do you do here? And I said, oh, I'm an architect. And he immediately said, oh, we don't have architects at ThoughtWorks. And I said, oh, really? Okay, that's interesting news to me. He said, we have tech leads instead. Because at that time, architect had become a dirty word. But through the magic of microservices, people realized that, hey, if you do architecture just right, magically, it's a business strategic advantage. So this is the analogy I always use when people talk about, well, we don't really need architects. We can just kind of spin it up as we need it. And there's this idea in the design world that you shouldn't start designing a lorry. You should start with a roller skate, and then a bicycle, and then a car, and then a truck, and then a lorry. That's kind of this iterative design. The problem in architecture, though, is roller skates and lorries have different fundamental capabilities about weight and speed and distribution. And so if I'm designing a doghouse, I don't need an architect. I need lumber and hammer and nails. If I'm designing a 50-story office building, I have to do some planning. And that's architecture. Now, this whole idea that we don't really need architects anymore is we don't really need these ivory tower go off for long periods of time architects. What agile architecture really means to me is the ability to do iterative design so you can get fast feedback. Mark and I, in our books, write about how to do this a lot. How do you create a perspective design and then iterate on that design to try to reach a good place and get feedback on it before you try to implement something. So it really depends on how complicated the problem is to how much you need architecture, but complicated things need planning. They need structure, and that's what architecture really is.
Yeah, I think that's right. There is a tipping point at which you need to have someone. I started advocating, I want to say about a year ago, for a full-time architect, and this happened when I realized there was a small handful of us who did this part-time, and we were no longer doing it well because it was just not enough time to dedicate to complex problems. So yeah, the role is still very much needed.
Yeah, I would like to ask you both, for example, if you start needing a software architect, when do you need another architect and then another architect? And sometimes you end up having a department of architects and then have another department of architects and a vertical. So how can we manage that situation? Do we have a software architect on top of another software architect?
But that's more an organizational dysfunction than an architecture dysfunction, isn't it?
Actually, I was wondering which kind of competencies the architects should widen in the question. There's my doubt. I don't know which kind of competence in general should we acquire more than software architecture. In which sense?
Okay. The second question is quite interesting. So I was promoted. Now I'm a software architect. What first steps should I do to succeed?
Get used to going to a lot of meetings.
Be very, very patient.
Yeah, so coming back to my current issues in my company, so we are going through a big merger between two big companies, and we already appointed many software architects that need to do something good with the two solutions, let's say. So to be proficient or to be good at that thing means that at the same point in the future, we will need to continue to deliver new features, and this is something that we need to measure well. So a good sign of success would be if this software architect that is being promoted, a way to measure their goals and how many of them have been successful or not. So it's necessary to have a list of goals and track them basically, so everyone understands perfectly what a software architect's goal is at the end. Mm-hmm. So it's not something that we can just say it's a software architect that is here. It needs to be very precise on the work that delivers.
Okay. That question, of course, is related to AI. So let me read it. It would be nice to hear a deeper elaboration on topic about AI application for architecture analysis, building and verification from different perspectives.
So the question is how AI is helping?
So yeah, AI application in software architecture.
Yeah, I can answer. What we are doing currently is trying to do everything, almost everything with AI. Still we don't know what the outcomes will be. But for example, we are trying to summarize ADRs with AI, but still on the process to understand whether this is a good thing or not. I can explain the problem. So we are now, because of the merging a lot of problems all together. We are creating a lot of ADRs, so a lot of documentation, and some teams maybe too early, but they are trying to put all together with this AI to come up with some documentation that can fit all the problems. Of course, this is a very early status, but this is something we are just trying. Apart from that, we still don't do anything else. Yeah.
Well, maybe idea that maybe in the future it will be very useful for this kind of fitness functions, for code inspection and so on. But my feeling is that right now, as there are no standards, exact standards about how to structure the code, how to well, in general, the perfect code. So today is something that is far away. That's my suspicion.
Thank you. So coming back to fitness functions. Should fitness functions fail a build or integration, or should they be used more informatively for architects and developers to review issues without affecting the release process?
I've got the perfect answer for this question. It depends. Because it depends on what you're doing with it. Sometimes, so if it's a security violation, you probably want to fail the build. If it's these two things really shouldn't be chatting with one another, but sometimes they do, then that's probably a casual notification. It's very much contextual. So it's dangerous in software architecture to try to create these global pronouncements about things, these best practices. Mark got in a bunch of trouble at a conference a few years ago by saying that there are no best practices in software architecture. And it's true in the structural design and decisions like that, because when you think about it, the idea of a best practice is anytime this situation comes up, I can just turn my brain off and always do that thing, because it's the best practice. It's not even a better practice, it's the best. So it brooks no argument, I have to do that, it's the best thing to do. But you can't make those kind of pronouncements in software architecture because there are always variables that you have to trade off. Companies would love for us to come in and once and for all say, we're using choreography for everything. Great, that makes all of our decisions a lot simpler, but it doesn't work for some situations because the trade-offs are bad for some situations versus the other. So it's annoying that we have to keep doing this trade-off analysis, but that's the job. That's why we have work, is to keep doing this trade-off analysis. So that's a perfect example. You can't make a sweeping pronouncement and say, always do it in CI, because it's always going to depend on the context and what value it's giving to what you're doing. I think the really important thing is, and this goes especially true for fitness functions, because you can go crazy with these things and start chasing rabbits down holes and shaving yaks. You've always got to come back to, is this adding value to my software development process? Is this adding more value than it's costing me effort to put into it? And a lot of that goes into the decision of when does it execute and how often does it execute, because is it giving me value or is it creating noise? And you want to carefully balance those things, I think, in any addition to a software development process.
Mm-hmm. There has been a lot of talks about architecture decisions, how to document them, diagrams, etc., etc. So the question is, how we make sure people actually read it or even become aware that it exists?
Well, storytelling, I think, is an important part of it. And as you get old, when you're a junior developer, it's really annoying to hear, well, when I did this, this is how we did it. But as you get more and more senior, it's actually really satisfying to tell those stories. And those stories make up the lore of software engineering. When we did this, these were the mistakes that were made. These were the right decisions that were made. This is why we made them. I think telling those stories and educating in a way that's not condescending, that's informative, that brings you to the right point, I think is critical.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about modular monoliths? Pros and cons, just a new trend, matter of taste, or you see more concrete use case advices?
I guess I should say something, and my goal is to say something without mentioning Vlad, and I've already failed. So everything I say, I always have to mention Vlad, but I would actually start by encouraging people to familiarize themselves with Vlad's concepts, to make that terminology part of the way you think and work. And I think the other thing about the challenge with monoliths is often around deployments. What was the exact question, sorry? I was thinking about Vlad too much.
Wait a second, I'll go back to it. Okay, so what are your thoughts about modular monoliths, pros and cons, just a new trend, matter of taste, or you see more concrete use case advices?
So me personally, yeah, as a consultant, I am seeing some trends. I think there is a shift back towards, I wouldn't necessarily say monolithic, but I would definitely say less fine-grained. Had a few conversations recently where people are saying things like, we have to touch 15 different microservices owned by a bunch of different teams to implement a new feature. So I think, and I also saw a talk about a bank in London, like a challenger bank. They're like 5 or 6 years old. They started with a monolith. They went to microservices. They experienced both kinds of pain. And now they're like, yeah, we're trying to find this happy middle ground. So I think, yeah, I think in terms of trends, people are moving back that way a bit. But a challenge with the monolithic approach is, you know, can teams deploy things independently? That's one of the key challenges. I don't think, I'm not seeing that solved in an entirely monolithic architecture just yet. So I think there's always going to be, maybe not always, but I still see a lot of need for distributed teams owning different parts, things that can be deployed independently.
Okay, thank you. What are the disadvantages of following the fitness functions methodology?
Disadvantage of fitness functions? Well, like anything, it takes extra time to build them. I mean, it's just like the disadvantages of unit tests. I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages of everything. So you can overspecify them. You can let a bunch of architects go crazy and create basically a puzzle that developers can't solve as they try to code and check things in. We realized when we started talking about this idea that we're giving architects a sharp stick with which they could poke developers. And we asked them, please don't use the sharp stick to poke developers. Because you could, you know, it could really go off the tracks. But that's true with any kind of, a lot of people here have worked under just ridiculously heavyweight governance processes, and it's the exact same thing there. So there are always disadvantages to everything in software architecture. Again, I go back to what value is it adding to my project versus the cost it's incurring to have it in place. And if ever you get to the place where the cost is greater than the value, then you should stop doing it, no matter what it is, regardless if it's fitness functions or unit testing or anything like that, because you need to look at, you know, there's this constant struggle about, you know, are we as IT adding value to the organization that we're working in? And I think we have to stay hyper-focused to that because we are prone to get distracted by shiny things. And that can be a little dangerous if the shiny thing leads you off somewhere that, you know, ends up getting your division canceled or something like that.
It's really, really hard to be here in this company because you think about something you want to say and then it's too late. And of course, the only thing that I cannot figure out how many times can I mention your name in this answer without saying anything useful. So yeah, thank you for answering the previous question, Nick.
I've broken you, haven't I?
All right. Is there any particular metric, material, guideline you like to follow for pull request sizes? I repeat again. Is there any particular metric, material, guidance you like to follow for pull request sizes?
I could say something if there's a void. Oh, you look like you were about to say something, so jump in. No? So I'll just be that guy and say, I've never really seen pull requests done that well, so I don't really have much to offer. I've always worked in mob programming or pair programming, used that approach. I've just always been frustrated by the pull requests. I think, you know, sizes, approaches. I've always been in a position where I've created a pull request and I'm chasing people, please, please, please approve this thing. It's been outstanding for days. So I'm not against pull requests. I'm just saying I've never found an optimal size and I've never really managed to solve the problem.
We had some success with shared channels where pull requests get surfaced out and anybody who's available can go review it and post it and discuss it. It's hard to keep this from, you know, just looks good to me, moving on. But it helps to encourage people to look at some of the shared code that's going up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in our case at Adevinta, with more than 100 teams, we have different approaches to pull requests. So 5 years ago, when I joined after working for ThoughtWorks, I was against totally the PRs, But then I realized there are multiple contexts, and yeah, most of the cases PRs are slowing down the development, but in some few cases PRs can be okay. Not very supportive about them. I would like to remove them if possible, just to go as fast as possible. But in a very few cases, it might make sense. The good thing when I face this discussion is not to be very aggressive with teams and not telling them to remove PRs completely or directly, because some of them are not ready because of testing, lack of culture, or lack of whatever. But if we put the focus on going fast, at the end of the day, we will, most of the team, we will remove not only PRs, but also environments, so staging environments, pre-environments, whatever environments they do before going to production, because they are not having enough feedback. So, yeah. Summarizing, against PRs in most of the cases, but open to discussion depending on the context of the teams.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. How do you integrate fitness function code with development code?
Can you say that again?
How do you integrate fitness function code with development code?
It's easy. You just run it. But it's just another test. So it's like, how do you integrate unit tests with? But I mean, it depends on the fitness functions. If it's a monitor, it's running in DevOps. If it's something like ArcUnit, it's running as part of a build process. So it's just code. There's nothing magic about it. There's nothing different about it than any other code. It's just automated governance code.
So I have a question myself about fitness functions. Do you find in your experience that developers disable fitness functions in order to compile and just to go?
In dysfunctional organizations, yes. But
okay.
But it's the same for saying, you know, well, I can't make this unit test pass, so I'll just delete the unit test. That's one way to solve the problem.
Okay.
It's not a good sustainable way to solve the problem. But that's an indication of a deep dysfunction in an organization, because what you're having is developers actively saying, I see this governance in place, it must be there for some reason, I'm going to ignore that reason rather than go to an architect and say, look, this is causing me schedule pressure or something like that.
Yeah.
How can we talk about that to resolve that tension? The resolving the tension is not deleting the thing and hoping and praying that the thing you just deleted is not some critical feedback loop that in 6 months is like, why is this blowing up all of a sudden?
Yeah,
it's like, we had a test for that. It's like, oh yeah, somebody commented that out because they needed something to pass. Okay. But I think that's a process problem, not a fitness function problem.
Yeah. Yeah, but it may cause some friction, no, between...
Well, it has to be collaborative, so it cannot be that architects just rain down fitness function on developers' heads. They have to understand the value of these things. They have to say it's automated governance. It's the safety scaffolding that allows you to experiment and do the stuff at the fastest speed because you have really fast feedback. So in teams that I've seen use this well, it is a collaborative effort between architects and developers, and because developers write code that fail the fitness functions, and they have to make them work again, and it takes more effort, and so there has to be a payback for that. So.
I have a question regarding the fitness functions, because the first time I read about them, I wasn't quite sure where we need to run the fitness functions, and still struggling to understand that. Is it so? Who is responsible for the fitness functions? The product teams, or
this goes back to the first question. It depends. So if this is something where I'm checking the structure of my code, I want this to run in a continuous integration pipeline as soon as I check in, conjoined with unit tests, because that's the fastest feedback loop. So what is the thing I'm most concerned with by my coders? I have designed a layered architecture, and they have violated the layers in my architecture and created coupling I don't want. I want the fastest feedback possible because I don't want them building on that bad code. That's the problem with code reviews. If you do code reviews once a month, you've been building on bad code for a month, and you've got to untangle that mess. And so but it really depends on how quickly you want that feedback as to where it happens. So one of the things we talk about are proactive versus reactive fitness functions. So let's say that you have a situation where these two services should not communicate with each other for whatever architectural reason. Well, if it's a security concern because of PII or something like that, I'm going to put a monitor in place that says anytime you try to talk to that, raise a flag and prevent that from happening, that creates overhead in my system, little bit of extra performance overhead, or if it's just they really shouldn't talk, but sometimes they do, then I may set up something that scans logs after the fact to see did they actually talk to one another. So it really depends on what you're trying to get it to do as to when you run it, but you try to tend toward the fastest feedback loop you can get for that particular thing.
So how do you think of obsoleting fitness functions? You talked about a developer actively commenting it out because they're trying to get around it, but maybe it's no longer applicable. Maybe the two services that couldn't talk to each other now can.
Really?
What would be the, I would say, legitimate way of obsoleting a fitness
Exactly
function?
the same as a developer legitimately deleting a unit test. Unit tests are not immutable. We delete them all the time when we don't need them anymore. We refactor them or change this unit test into a functional test, or this functional test into a user acceptance test. You occasionally take fitness functions and turn them into unit tests. The split between those things is really unit tests test the domain and the behavior of the application, whereas fitness functions test capabilities like scalability and security. But it may be that security becomes a really core important part of your domain, and you actually move some of those over into the domain. But it's not something that you should arbitrarily do because it's causing you inconvenience, but it's something that's just part of the evolution of the code base, just like you get rid of unit tests. We had worried about that structure for a while, but it's stable, so let's get rid of the unit test because it takes a long time to run. Maybe your performance fitness function takes a long time to run for some reason, and you don't like that. Again, it goes back to value. If it starts chipping away at the value of having it there, I would get rid of it aggressively. I think it's important that code bases are living, breathing things because they keep evolving all the time, and you have to keep the support mechanisms that allow them to evolve as up to date as the code base.
Yeah, I want to ask a bit more about this because if I look at my company and I want to understand whether the architecture is good or not, I would like to have a way to look at it, and so then we created what we call fitness board, where we see metrics, but I'm not quite sure whether this is exactly coming from fitness functions or what. So my question is, how can I make sure in my company with 2,000 developers that everyone can understand that the architecture is compliant with some ADRs or some agreements? Can I use fitness functions for that, or it's something?
It depends on if it's what structure, if it's something like structure or something like communication. So a lot of fitness functions so companies build API layers between the parts of the company so they can communicate between accounting and inventory without having to know the details. Well, you may put fitness functions around the contracts about how they communicate with each other because inventory always has to have this amount of information. So no matter how much you change in there, make sure that this information is always there. That's a form of fitness function. But it's really just, so I would turn that question around to say, your large organization, how do you do architectural governance now? Because fitness functions are just an automated way to do architectural governance. So we're huge fans of architectural governance, but doing it manually sucks because it takes too long, and there's no way that you can scale enough to do it manually. So just like other things in software development, we find ways to automate the things that are automatable and put those in place to manage the simple things and leave the more complicated things to enterprise architects. There's a very distinct role for them because as much as we'd love to magic away all governance with automated fitness functions, you can't. There's still some that are really tricky, but there are a lot of them you can automate, so why not? That's the...
I'll catch up with you later, maybe. I want to stack to this question, but I'm super interested in understanding more.
We actually, the subtitle, we changed the subtitle of the second edition of the book to Automated Software Governance, because that's really what it is a way to automate these kind of governance tasks. And this is diverging a little bit, but all these frameworks like TOGAF and all these frameworks, these agile frameworks, it seems like every one of them are trying to install bureaucratic layers for reporting, because that's what frameworks do. And what we try to do when we go into organizations and say, can we get rid of that little bureaucratic layer with some sort of feedback loop? And if it's automated, even better, because it collapses a lot of those layers of stuff that you don't need in a lot of places.
Okay, and one more question about fitness functions. So should fitness functions be integrated in the same repository of a project code? We have thought to create a library for this purpose and add it in all development projects.
Okay, everybody say it with me. It depends. I don't know. Sometimes yeah, sometimes no. It depends on what you're using it for in the situation.
Okay, let's continue with the questions. So I guess that's for you, Nick. What challenges have you faced when trying to change company culture to achieve an independent team structure?
The question was something and team structure?
Yes. What challenges have you faced when trying to change company culture to achieve an independent team structure?
Oh, I mean, in a lot of my career as a consultant, I've been supporting this process and maybe not leading it, so I've seen it from different perspectives. Pretty much every challenge you can name, really. On the people side, you get I think in every company you get a whole mix of people, some who are excited, some who are open-minded, and some who just aren't up for it, don't like it, and will either stay and sabotage or they'll leave the company. I think that's the most common one. What else? So yeah, around introducing new cultures, what else comes to mind? Yeah, I think, probably on the opposite side of that, the people who are really keen to do that, working with those people can work, find the people who are interested. And I would say if you're doing some modernization work, for example, and you're thinking like, where do we start modernizing the system? How do we start defining a domain-driven design, architecture, loosely coupled systems, and autonomous team? Actually thinking about the people at that point is one of their key criteria. So you might say, this part of the system over here is the easiest part to break out, or is the most interesting thing to start modernizing. But actually, this part of the system over here is where the people who are most interested in trying these new ideas work. And so we'll go more on the team side. We'll choose projects that will involve the people who are most likely to be interested, effective, successful in introducing these ideas. So I guess, that's the first thing that comes to mind. I'll try and think of one other thing quickly and then let someone else jump in. I would probably say, in my experience, the in-person workshops is what I do a lot of as a consultant, which I see having the most impact. So an example would be a Canadian company working on different sides of the country. So some people in the same office, some people not in the same office. Had quite a gap, I would say, between product people and the developers. And very traditional approaches in how they work, but then doing an in-person workshop with something like event storming, where you've got sales, marketing, developers, product, all these people together, and they're spending some time mapping out the current system together. They're spending some time then thinking about how might we optimize these processes. So like, I think in the example I'm thinking of, there was a salesperson, someone who worked in sales, and she had a process with 180 steps. And everyone, like, no one knew about that, and no one could really believe it, but it was true. So just having all those different perspectives come together and realizing, oh, I'm a developer, and there's so much stuff I could be doing to help other parts of the company. That was a revelation. And then we also had, like, it was quite a small company. So we had the CTO there, the COO there, and the CEO who were floating around. And we had some comments like, so we had this event storm mapped out across the wall, probably almost not quite the length of that wall there, but not far off. And it was chunked up into subdomains. And someone said, that is effing impressive. I literally swore they were that happy. And I think some of the other comments from like the CEO were, this is just not how we've ever worked before, having all these different roles in the same space, doing some collaborative modeling, solving problems together. And we also spent some time discussing ways of working. Like, if you move to this domain-driven design approach, what does a good team look like? Just letting everyone share their thoughts on things like, how do we prioritize? How do we deploy stuff? How do teams collaborate between them? So I think the two key points I was trying to get at there were, firstly, if you're kicking off something new, picking projects that involve the right people. On paper, something might be best from a business perspective or a technical perspective, but it might not involve the people who are most likely to be successful. And then the second one is around in-person gatherings, doing mapping, modeling, problem solving together, cross-functional. I think those moments can, if your company hasn't done that before, you can get a real sense of magic. Like this is just, all these people together in the same room, mapping stuff out, and create a magical experience and incentivize people to want to do more of it.
Thank you. Isn't volatility a consequence of the pain?
Could you please repeat that?
Isn't volatility a consequence of the pain?
Oh, sorry, all I hear is echo. Isn't volatility a consequence of the pain? Isn't volatility a consequence of the pain? Well, it can be, yeah. So, to start, it's the other way around. So you have volatility, you have to change your modules, and then you experience that pain. But that pain can result in suboptimal solution, which will result in even more volatility, which is going to be basically bug fixes. So yeah, I guess it works both ways, but it starts with volatility in the business. And that resultant volatility its source is more in the solution domain.
Thank you. How to validate that volatility is correct? Maybe it should be lower or higher, and we can implicitly influence on it, can't we?
Oh, yeah, so that's a hard question. So there is no right and wrong here, but if we start by analyzing the business domain, the subdomain in question, let's say that you identify that it's a supporting subdomain. It's a CRUD data entry screen, nothing interesting there, and the business shouldn't be really interested in changing it quite often, and you do observe volatility there. Then you have to ask whether the source of those changes is business requirements. If that's the case, maybe it's a supporting subdomain that changes into a core subdomain. And in the book, there is a chapter about that. So there are 3 dimensions. All of them can change over time. Distance can grow because of organizational growth, for example. Strength can be increased because of reasons. Maybe the code isn't maintained and some hacks are introduced. And volatility can change as well. So, for example, again, a subdomain can morph from one type to another. So that's the first case. You may expect low volatility, but then suddenly it starts growing over time. So that could be an explanation, a change in the business domain. And the second case that I can think about is, well, the one from the previous question. Maybe there is some big ball of mud there, and that's artificial volatility, just people fixing bugs over bugs over bugs.
Thank you. And how often do you come back to the ADRs you made?
Is it a question for?
For everyone. Well, I guess mostly for Sonya.
I would say as needed. It's good to have that history. We dig it up when things start happening, problems start emerging, and again, we tell the stories with those ADRs that exist. Now, if I'm being very honest, this is a practice that isn't perfect. We practice it, but whenever we had documented decisions, we were very grateful that we had them. They always worked for the better. And when we didn't, results varied. Sometimes it was very bad because we didn't know why a certain decision was made. We weren't certain on how to make the next one. And that gets really tough. You basically start building a house of cards that can fall down. But when we had them, we referred to them when we needed to, and it was wonderful.
So here's a challenge that I'll put out in front of everybody here to make your ADRs fantastically useful. So there's a giant consulting company that I know of that the way they work is they have an expert in this particular financial field, and somebody's working over here, and they get advice from this person. Every time they do that, they create a connection, and if they make a sale, this person gets a bonus. Incentives. The biggest problem I see with ADRs is not getting people to create them, it's getting people to reuse the things and actually refer to them later on. And so here's your challenge as an organization. Figure out a way to incentivize the reuse of ADRs in your company. I don't know if it's a bonus, I don't know if it's vacation days, I don't know if it's gold stars on the refrigerator in the break room, but something that encourages teams to actually reuse this because it really captures research and thought, deep thought that went into a problem that, like you say, it just disappears into the universe if you don't either write it down or, even worse, you wrote it down and then nobody looked at it. Because then you wasted the effort more than one time. So I think that's the real challenge, is finding a way to incentivize it.
I think incentives are great. I think the biggest barrier is searchability, which is why I'm a huge fan of not keeping them in the code repos. We don't live in a mono repo, so it's like, where do you look, which one? And if you're able to search it and find it quickly, that's the best. And one of the things that I strive for is to make things very, very searchable. Put a bunch of keywords on the page if you have to, as long as you're able to find it.
I think there was also a tool that was transforming ADR to a website for everyone. Maybe that could help.
So, how to raise the importance of documenting?
Ooh, this is a good one. I think first you need to make it part of your team culture. I don't know if you have team norms. When you bring in new engineers, we tend to put the team norms in front of them. One of the team norms is we're the team that documents. This is the norm. You have to live it, and you have to keep others accountable to it. The other one, you really have to set an example. So you model the behavior you want to see. Don't come into a conversation with nothing written down. Don't leave the conversation without more things written down. You can also make it a bit of a sticking point, a milestone. Like definition of done can include some level of documentation that you have to produce. I think most important thing is you have to give people time to document. That's the thing that I find that is most challenging. Engineers will focus on the engineering tasks and they run from one task to the next. You have to give designated time to document. I am personally a very slow writer and I need time to focus on that documentation. It's great for organizing your thoughts, but it takes me a long time to do it.
Thank you. Architect as a consultant service. How effective can an architect be in a short-term role where there is not enough time to get to know development teams and their dynamics?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Architect as a consultant service. How effective can an architect be in a short-term role where there is not enough time to get to know development teams and their dynamics?
I think you can be very effective, just probably not as an architect in the sense of making decisions. I think what you can do as an external person. I actually had this conversation recently as part of my work, when I started working with a new client, and we're thinking about having these in-person workshops. There's a couple of things I want to say, so if I say that out loud, I won't forget to say the second one. So I forgot the first one now, though. I think what I was going to say was, so the first one is, as an external person, you can surface insights that maybe aren't possible if you're a full-time employee. So for example, I was talking to someone recently who worked in an operations team, and a lot of their work was getting data into a spreadsheet. I'm not making this up. I promise you I'm not making this up. A lot of their work was getting data into a spreadsheet. They had like 100 tabs, and they were saying things like, we spend so much time trying to get the data in this format, we can't produce insights for the business like when the hardware devices aren't working. And the point is, when people see a different person who's not working in the company, they might go deeper into their thoughts. A good example of this is my friend Indu. When she's working at New York Times, and one of the questions she asks people is, what have you given up asking for? And as a consultant, that's the kind of thing that people might tell you. You know, they might have told other people in the company 50 times already about something. No one's ever fixed it, so they've stopped mentioning it. So as an external person coming in, they might reveal more things to you. That was the first part. Yeah, and the second part, the second thing that came to my mind was around making decisions. I think a lot of companies get stuck in analysis paralysis, a lot of options. So in my particular example, companies are like, want to start modernizing our systems. Where do we even start? Do we start in this domain, or this domain? And I think as an external person, whilst you probably shouldn't make that decision as a contract architect, you've got enough domain expertise that you can help them along the way. So one simple technique is touching on what Sonya mentioned earlier around dates. So you can ask a question like, at what date would it be a problem if you haven't started doing any work? And they might have a clear date, or you might have to work on one, but at least you've helped them to realize, you know, if your analysis paralysis continues past that point, it's worse than actually just not picking something and starting. So then, as a consultant, you can help them to choose a date, choose that last responsible moment, and then help them through that process of making a decision. And because you're an architect, you know, you kind of understand the challenges and trade-offs, how you might prioritize work, why certain choices might be more important, why certain things might be a dead end. So to summarize, I think as an external consultant operating in an architecture space, trying to have an impact on a short-term basis, I think it would be very risky, and it's not something I would recommend in general for you to think that you can make a decision in that time frame. But I think helping people towards making a decision and surfacing insights that maybe aren't currently on people's minds, that's definitely something you can do in the short term.
Just to add a few words to Nick's answer without mentioning Nick again. Yeah, so what was Nick saying is that our power is by asking good questions. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Jerry Weinberg's book, Secrets of Consulting, where he says that your job as a consultant is to ask good questions. Now, yeah, you don't have a lot of knowledge about that company, about software engineers, but that can be a strength as well. Your mind is free to ask questions, to investigate things that people working for the company would never think about. And going back to the theme of a couple of talks today, it depends. So again, it's your job as an expert to know what it depends on. And that will help you to steer the decision-making of the customer. That's the way you can help them to make better decisions. Again, asking good questions and knowing what it depends on.
Thank you. Software architect versus solutions architect. What's the difference?
I don't think there's any difference because they're both made-up titles. I mean, one of the problems with architect is there's no official designation of architect anywhere in the world. So it's just made up. And so companies said, well, they're developer, and now they're senior developer, and now they're tech lead. It's like, we got to keep promoting them. We got to call them something. Okay, architect. We'll call them architect. So you go to some organizations and there are like 3 kinds of architects, and you go to others and there are 20 kinds of architects. So it really depends on the organization that you're in. What do you mean by solution architect? Is that someone who cares about domains and how they map to physical architecture, or is it someone who is the product owner? I've seen both of those roles be played by someone who's a solution architect. So it really depends more on the organization, because it's kind of a meaningless title in most of the world. This is my experience.
In theory, it's like the opposite of the enterprise architect. I mean, the enterprise is the one that is fixing criteria and so on, and the solution architect is applying the criteria to. This is, I know that it's a quite old definition, but in theory, it should work.
Sounds good to me.
It works for you.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, it works for you. Okay.
Yeah, so as someone who bears 2 titles, cloud architect and software architect, I just give you a little advice. Don't take any software architecture advice from a cloud architect. So if that's the case in that company, the person that asked about a solution architect being more of a system architect that deals with cloud architecture and stuff, don't take software architecture advices from them. In fact, do the opposite.
Yeah, I generally agree. I think the best distinction I've heard is software architect as somebody who operates within a single domain or a single system, and solutions architect is across multiple domains or multiple systems, but it is pretty arbitrary.
Okay, next question. What should I, as an architect, mainly focus on when monitoring my system?
When what?
Yeah.
What should I, as a software architect, mainly focus on when monitoring my system?
What should I, as a software architect, focus on when monitoring my system?
Okay,
everybody together. What is valuable for you to monitor in your system? I can't answer that, but hopefully you can.
I think one thing that's interesting to monitor is around the DORA metrics. This is more on the side of how easy is it to change and evolve the architecture. I think that's definitely becoming very popular in circles I'm seeing. I wouldn't take the DORA metrics as some holy grail, that's the only thing. But I think if you're thinking, I'm an architect, what kind of things can I start? I'm not sure if I would say measuring, but tracking, observing, and using to drive some of our decisions as an organization. I think the DORA metrics are a great starting point.
Yeah, I think defining what's important is key. I had a question asked of me recently by one of the VPs. I want to see this customer portal uptime metrics because I need to make sure we have sufficient staff if it goes offline to help out. I said, the portal is always up. What exactly, the only time we take it down is when we need to do major upgrades. What exactly are you looking for? What he was looking for is specific functionality continuing to work, and just because a website is up doesn't mean that functionality can't degrade for other reasons. There's a dozen services underneath, there's other platforms that are helping, so we define that as a metric. Have this functionality that delivers information to physicians, make sure that that stays up. We constructed that metric out of a number of different systems, them being up, them being able to interact with each other, and we gave that information to him. So again, define what's important. It really does focus on the business.
And that is what Sonya just talked about, is exactly what I was talking about in my talk this morning about hyper-specific metrics that are valuable to a single organization. You couldn't take that to any other organization and then get excited about it, but for your organization, that's exactly what you needed for that. So that, and wire that into a fitness function, and now you know that that thing is working all the time. So there is one thing that's monitoring, so I suspect the question is about technical monitoring, like observability, but one of the interesting things that we saw on the most recent edition of the ThoughtWorks Technology Radar, which I helped put together, is we've seen this uptick in tools that try to monitor developer productivity. And before you get ill and start thinking about that, because we've known forever you can't really measure developer productivity. In fact, Martin Fowler even wrote a blog about the inability to measure productivity. But what these new frameworks are measuring is interesting because they're not trying to directly measure productivity. They're measuring useful things like how long is this developer allowed to stay in flow state without interruptions? That's useful to monitor because that's productivity. Regardless of lines of code or any of that other stuff, if you can keep them working without interruptions, that's great. And that's actually something that's pretty useful to start monitoring. And we suspect that the uptick in interest in this is manager types who never really understood what coders are doing anyway are now really worried that they're going to start playing with the shiny AI stuff, and they want to answer the question, is it making them any more productive, or are they just playing with new toys and actually slowing down? So that's going to be a kind of an interesting question to see once we start baking in all this AI stuff is it actually making people more productive, or are you spending more time tweaking your prompts than you spent Googling for error messages before? It's an interesting question.
So I actually think measuring how long you stay in flow state is really easy. You just measure how long the Slack is muted, and you're done.
Slack is where productivity goes to die.
I kind of disagree with your approach in terms of, so there are some metrics that my experience is telling me that are more or less good for every organization, like the DORA metrics. For the last 4 years, we have been measuring DORA metrics for more than 40 teams, and just looking at them and digging into the information that comes with them, we are getting useful information, and we are trying to extend that in more teams in our organization. They are super simple, and getting the information from the speed metrics and the stability ones, it's super easy for us to understand. Of course, we need the context of the teams, but only with that information, we can get a lot of information. If I ever need to change company and maybe become a director or whatever, the first thing I would ask are the DORA metrics, because we have experienced a lot of that. We are getting a lot of information, and not only for architects or managers or from people looking outside, also for the teams, realizing what the metrics they have, they are making a lot of progress. When we started 4 years ago, we didn't know exactly how impact they will have just knowing or measuring them, but we realized they are really correlated with the performance or something more important, the happiness. So the title here. So we are starting to measure the happiness of the teams with simple things like the ping test, so the 3 questions about mastery, purpose, and autonomy. And also we have introduced the office vibe, so we can ask teams every once a week how they feel about that. And we see this, maybe it's only happening in Adevinta, but I'm curious to know what's happening everywhere. But this is connected. Teams that are considered productive are correlated with the good metrics and also with happiness altogether. So coming back, I see there are some metrics like DORA ones that I think we can introduce them everywhere and get useful information. Of course, there are others maybe that are pretty custom, and depending on the organization, you can get more info or not. But there are some I think we can extend in many companies. This is my point of view.
Anyway, I have another question. Whether we are on the same territory when we speak about DORA metrics and the fitness function, because metrics are one thing, and there's an intersection with fitness function, but it's not exactly the same. That's my question.
But DORA metrics are just something you would measure as a fitness function. If you cared about DORA metrics, you would measure those, and that would be a fitness function. SonarQube are fitness functions. Just because it comes packaged as metrics, chaos engineering is fitness functions. They never call it that, but that's exactly what it is. It's any mechanism that helps you validate architecture characteristics. So DORA metrics are absolutely fitness functions if you're using them to determine something useful about your architecture. So,
I see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah, but discussion, if I may, is whether fitness function, or do we have a set of fitness functions that works for every company? It depends.
Well, but that's exactly the question that says that, there are a lot of insurance companies And a bunch of them have written unit tests when they wrote their insurance applications. Can I just take their set of unit tests and build my insurance application out of their unit tests? Too specific.
Yeah,
all fitness functions are extremely application specific. We were hoping when we wrote the book that we would find this magical set that would bubble up and say, these shall be universally applied everywhere, and we didn't find any of them. There are some, like cyclomatic complexity, you could argue that overly complex code bases are universally bad, probably. But then you get into the problem of essential versus accidental complexity. Is it supposed to be that complicated? Is it? So that's the problem we run into there. It's as much a fingerprint as the unit test or functional test. The good thing about fitness functions, though, is that they're nowhere near as volatile as unit and functional tests are, because unit tests, so the thing that changes the fastest in your development is the thing you're writing software about, kind of by definition. Once you've established the capabilities we want to support, like performance and scale, those fitness functions don't have to change on a very rapid basis unless you change those capabilities. So they're much more static, but they do evolve slowly over time. It's just a different rate of change.
I would like to insist on this point because I think that I have the same doubt as Alejandro, because let's go at low level. There are metrics, system metrics, like for example file descriptors that are very important to monitor always, because they normally cause a lot of issues in production if you don't control them. So that could be some kind of metric that is universal.
Well, but what about a system what I don't care about? What if it doesn't have to be a reliable system? I mean, the internet, you know, the reliable internet is based on an unreliable protocol. So,
okay.
But I mean, so this is the problem, and Mark and I do this experiment all the time. What's universally applicable to architecture?
No.
And we can't find stuff because you can always find exceptions. So you can say mostly this is applicable. Security is almost always important in software architecture. But there are cases where speed to market is more important than that. I mean, ask Facebook about security and speed to market and what's important. You know, they would give you a very different answer than most of us would, I think. So, but you know, it's just hard to say universally. But within a particular domain, so high-speed trading. Latency's got to be really low. That's pretty universal, but just for that domain. So
yeah, I see.
Universal things are really, really hard.
Okay, we have one interesting question here. What are the main architecture tools you use nowadays for diagrams and code architecture, code analysis? What are the tools that you use?
Tools for analysis?
For diagrams and code architecture analysis.
Whatever's available, whatever's simple. I think accessibility of tools is what matters most, just for fun. We had a lot of diagramming tools. We used Draw.io, we used Lucid, we used some other stuff, Miro, a few other things that were available. So what happened was everything was spread out and licenses cost a ton. So IT decided to cut some costs, condense licenses, and said, we're taking away all of the Lucid write licenses except for a few people. Read licenses are free. Well, that worked up until the moment you actually had to edit a diagram, and then everybody wanted that license back. So if you're starting out with something, pick a tool that's easily accessible and you can support the license costs, and make sure that if you're taking a tool away, then migrate their work back onto something that's usable, because we still needed the artifacts and nobody chose to migrate them.
Speaking about conceptual tools, I'm still fond of UML, sincerely, to be honest. UML as a sketch tool, not as a blueprint tool.
I couldn't get exactly the question because of the echo. So it's how to measure whether
so the tools that you use for diagrams and for,
yeah, so tools for diagrams, we use many, but I'm going to share what we use to understand whether the teams are complying with the architecture. This is the tool we use. We are following what we call golden path. So we have a set of tools that the team should comply, and this is mainly the tool that we have to measure how far they are from the expectation. This is what we do. If you are asking about how good a very specific architecture of a team, this is, I think every team has or have their own tools. So I don't see any global tool that we of course we can give advice on what to use because we have the guilds and the many meetings where we share things, but we don't have that thing. But I'm coming back to the golden path because it's something, it's paved road or golden path or whatever. We took it from Netflix, I don't know, but it's something that's really important to comply with the overall architecture. And this is the main tool we use when we talk about architecture in our company. So you can imagine in a set of boxes and with the standard or the technologies that we support as a company, and all the rest that are not there are not receiving support, basically. So this is what I'm not sure if the audience is, or you are familiar with the golden path of A-Road. I'm sure you are, but it's something we are really using every day.
Okay. As a consultant, mostly I end up using whatever our client is using for drawing tools. So I've used Mural and Miro and Draw.io and all those, and they're all more or less. As long as it has layers, I'm good. I like layers in my drawing tools. There are a lot of analysis tools that we end up using, like Independ in the .NET world or JArchitect in the Java world, to look at some of the architecture level metrics like afferent effort coupling and distance to the main sequence. But you know, it's wherever applicable in what you're trying to learn from your code base. SonarCube is heavily used just as a way of a nice canned set of fitness functions that look at code structure and a bunch of useful metrics like that. So, but you know, again, it's whatever adds value to your project. Fortunately, more and more of them are appearing over time. So when ArcUnit came out, it seemed like an outlier, but we're seeing more and more tools that support that kind of investigative testing and architecture. So I'm happy to see those kind of tools. I just saw one, in fact, that is basically ArcUnit for JavaScript. It's called a TSArc. So you can write architecture-level structural tests in the JavaScript ecosystem. So it's nice to see more of these tools coming up.
Yeah. Not a tool I'm using, but a tool I want to start using. Chris, is it contextual? Contextive? Yeah. So I got exposed to a tool that Chris is building. It's for managing ubiquitous language of a project. And it's called Contextive. It's something that looks really impressive, so I'm definitely going to check that out.
He spoke at BD London about his Contextive tool. Very interesting. We had an example, and Chris was like, he asked the audience, anyone here who's not a developer want to share some words from their domain? And we had a recruiter, and they were like, he was like, give us a terminology from your domain. And they were like, Boolean. And everyone was like, no, don't think of a technical term, give us a real word from your domain. And they were like, yeah, we have Boolean searches. Apparently that's the thing in the world of recruiting. And so we all thought his tool was just going to break and burn by using a keyword, but it didn't. So yeah, definitely a good tool to check out. He's put some thought into this.
Let me switch to another micro. This one? Okay. I don't know if it's better. Yeah, better? Okay, perfect. All right, so I feel like as an architect, I need to understand product and discovery, organization design, technical infrastructure, product design, agile and developer experience, and operations. Is this the right list? Do you find the role too big?
It's all in Nick Tune's new book.
It is a big role. I think that's a fact. It's probably the only role, and just more broadly software engineering role, where you're expected to understand a lot of these things basically know a lot about a lot, and there's rarely the reverse, where others are expected to understand how software is built. So that makes it for a very exciting challenge, but I think that's what elevates us, especially knowing how the business and product operates. To me, that's a super key area. If you're best friends with your product person and you know where they're driving, I think you're already at an advantage.
I couldn't agree more. Exactly. So my expectation when I'm asked about software architects is that, so a colleague asked me about this and said the same thing. You need to know everything with, almost everything. You are supposed to be a very experienced person, so you need to talk to everyone, interpersonally skills, breadth and depth of knowledge, technical knowledge and everything. And this is your expectation. You cannot elude not knowing whatever. You need to be really good at everything.
But I think it's important, particularly if you're just starting in architecture, every single architect I've ever met, no matter how great they were, still suffered from imposter syndrome. Because it is such a big role, nobody is confident that they know everything that they need to know about everything. And everybody is doubtful going into every meeting. Maybe I don't know enough to be in this meeting. And then you get there, it's like, oh, I know about that, I know about that. But it's a really common thing. So rather than be afraid of that, what you should do is identify the places where you do have gaps and then be eager to fill those things in. And my favorite way to do that is to pick somebody and pair with them. You know, I don't quite understand how the build works in this project. Let me pair with you for a few hours and we'll bang around and I'll understand the context of this, or the data, or the UI, or something like that. And that helps you fill in some of those gaps, because part of your overarching career goal as an architect is to be exposed to as many different things as you can, because that gives you more context for better decisions in the future. So you should be eager to try to put yourself in situations where you're not quite a good grounding yet, but you can learn a lot about it.
Yeah, when I feel like I've been parachuted in the middle of a battle, my strategy is simple. Explain like I'm 5, and that usually helps.
And what are your thoughts on minimum viable architecture?
It's a cool sounding term. You know, what is a minimum viable architecture? It depends on the thing you're building. I mean, a minimum viable architecture for a concert ticketing system has to have massive scalability. Minimum viable architecture for my kids' football team registration app is it runs. So
I think the keyword is viable. If it dies too fast, you didn't build it. I mean, it really is experimental, so you need to know how long you expect it to live before you have to change it.
But I think there's a supposition in the term minimum viable architecture, sort of like minimum viable product, which is this trope from the design world that you can just iteratively design yourself into a better architecture. And you can't. At some level, you'll reach a point where you can't scale anymore. If you've chosen a monolith, you will reach a point where you can't scale any past that. And so minimum viable product is a much easier concept to wrap your head around than minimum viable architecture, because you have to know something about where the end goal is, or at least have a path to get to where the end goal is before you can start thinking about, you know, what is suitable as an architecture, and, you know, how long does this architecture need to last, and what does it need to do during its lifetime.
I actually think minimum viable product has become a very ambiguous term, and I see a lot of people debating what does this actually mean. Is it, we've got things like minimum marketable feature, minimum lovable product. So someone said, I'm thinking about creating this new phrase, minimum viable architecture, to describe what I'm doing. I would just say that is going to be misinterpreted in many different ways, possibly completely counter to what you're trying to achieve. So I'd be very careful about going all in on phrases or acronyms like that.
Okay. How not to become an armchair architect? Tips, life hacks, thoughts? I guess it is related to how to keep being hands-on architect, right?
Pet projects, write some code,
maybe participate in...
Sorry. No, just pair programming.
So myself, for example, I try to code as much as I can, not in critical projects or critical paths. So I'm, for example, creating a platform bot for our team to react to things we do, but this is not something part of the product itself. So it keeps me feeling the pain of delivering. So I understand how the CI/CD tools work. I can understand exactly what the pains of the software developers are feeling every day, and this is for what I'm doing. So trying to code as much as I can, because otherwise, so I will be out of understanding what they are talking, and also I will lose trust. So it's impossible for me to talk to anyone not in technical terms, because they will start not listening to me, basically, if I lose this connection.
And what are, in your opinion, effective mechanisms to establish architectural governance besides fitness functions in larger organizations with multiple hundred developers?
I'm referring back to the golden path. So have a clear radar of all the tools that we are using, understanding what is advised and what is not, what is kind of outdated, and doing regularly sessions to keep up with this. We are trying to do it as automated as we can, so not trying to do it manually, but just in a blink of an eye. So looking at a Datadog panel or board or whatever, and see that all the technology is up to date, basically.
I think the important thing to understand is risk tolerance of the organization. If the organization is fairly conservative or risk averse, then you can basically present the risks, and that helps to establish governance, because a lot of the architecture is preventing failure, getting ahead of failure, getting ahead of losing market. If, however, the organization is very risk tolerant, then sometimes targeted failure helps, and feeling the pain of what it means not to look after your architecture, and that's when the governance kind of forms by itself.
And just about every large organization has good, strict governance around security. Not so much around architecture stuff, but security is where it really gets serious, where you might lose money or breaches and that kind of stuff. So you do see good non-automated security because it's such an important thing. And you could apply that same importance to architectural governance, but it doesn't seem as immediate a threat to the existence of the company. So you don't see as much effort in it. And it's one of those things that's been tried for a long time with a lot of bureaucratic frameworks and other stuff, none of which I've seen. I mean, any framework, if it's used just exactly right and with good intent, can be successful. But it's hard to say that I've seen a lot of great successes in governance in large organizations. But the other thing you have to ask is, do you really want governance? Sort of to Sonya's point, to govern something is to slow it down. So do you really want to slow your organization down so you get more consistency? I mean, that's the trade-off, is you slow down to get more consistency and less variability, but, is that what you want as an organization?
Yeah, it's interesting. We ask ourselves about the governance and how not to slow us down, and we decided to have a governance advice. So we advise teams to do this, but we are not slowing down, apart from security. Security is kind of forced, so they need to patch everything they have. That might become an issue. But we don't block teams anymore, and this is our advice. You should do this. You will have support and assistance if you do this, but if you don't want to do this, you can just go, but be out of the, again, golden path. This is what we mostly doing.
And what are your thoughts on measuring maintainability and other entities based on ISO definitions and standards?
The ISO definitions are quaint. The architecture characteristic definitions ISO were developed about, 15 years ago? So, it's a nice historical reference, but why? It depends. What is availability? What value is availability to your organization? Who cares what the ISO says about availability? It matters in your organization. You could over-engineer your system to the moon and get crazy availability and give no value whatsoever to your company. So, you know, it's one of those things that there's no way to pin down a hard and fast number on something like that.
And how to avoid big design upfront when doing the architecture document?
I guess I'm not sure how the two go together. Documents can happen at any time of the design. Big design up front sometimes can't be avoided, sometimes needs to happen if the decisions are really big. Not always. It's, you know, we tend to kind of go from one extreme to another, but for something really complex, I would rather sit down and design little something up front than hope that design emerges sprint over sprint. That is a very dangerous way for me to go. So the two, I don't think are related.
Maybe the question is about, I was talking to someone recently about the evils of templates in a large organization where every architecture decision had to have a UML use case associated with it. And he said, there is no UML use case because it makes no sense. It's like, yeah, but there's a place in the template for it. It has to be there. That's the kind of big documentation that you shouldn't have for design stuff. It's just useless, busy work kind of documentation. So maybe that's what they're getting at.
And last question for today. So would it be a good idea to implement the pain calculation and check as a fitness function?
Yeah, that would be an amazing idea, but unfortunately at this moment I have no idea how to do it. Once the book gets out, you are more than welcome to develop a way to do it. But yeah, we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for this Q&A session. Big applause.